I've been performing Chautauqua characters for many years now, both on stage, but I've also been teaching living history, as we call it, or Chautauqua style performance to students of all ages. As a college faculty teacher, I teach a class every other year and have my college students perform characters, but I've taught students as young as elementary school. What I love about teaching students to perform living history is it's first of all, it's a wonderful interdisciplinary way to approach the arts. It incorporates history and study and research into performing, and you can put those two things together, and it just excites a student to be able to learn about an era they didn't know. In addition, it's a fairly easy way to present theater and the arts to students. You don't need a lot of sets and costumes. Students work on their own, and I find them so motivated and so fascinated by certain periods of history or certain characters that it's a joy to see them grow in the performance of living history as they do it. So, as a performer myself, I think that what we have with the energy we have with audiences is special because of the question part. And there's a real dynamic and a real synchronicity between audience and performers. And I love sharing that with students.
I also have a background in performance, and I've been working on living history characters for, I don't know, about 18 or 19 years for me. And I approached it initially from the perspective of an actor. When you are working as an actor in a traditional sense, you're given a character and a role, and there's a certain amount of research that can go into playing a character in a traditional play. But one of the powerful aspects of living history is that the performer is playwright as well, in terms of researching the historical landscape of the time and place which the character you're playing lived. When you are researching a character, there are challenges in terms of finding first person sources, whether your character kept a journal or they were a figure that was in public media. Like in the case of researching Bobby Kennedy, there was a lot of speeches where I could hear his voice and see his mannerisms. And, it's a more modern character versus a character from a much longer time period ago. You are depending on letters and things like this. And then you're also sifting through different biographers' accounts of the person's life and times. And it's important and an exciting challenge as a Chautauqua performer to read both favorable and maybe not so favorable accounts and perspectives of the character. And so, as you can approach it as an actor would, I'm playing a character, and here are the things I will say. There's an added responsibility and challenge as a Chautauquan to say, how will I represent this character, and what framework, what point in the character's life I'm to represent this character. And it makes it a very exciting, sometimes daunting, challenging, but very fulfilling form of performance. And as I learned history as a grade school kid, or in middle school or high school, it was something that was presented as words on the page. Even in today's interactive multimedia, uh, you know, educational techniques, there can be a tendency for students to approach history in a very passive fashion. Being able to research a character's life and then put yourself out there on stage to represent this person in history really gives you some ownership and initiative to think about the character and the times in which they lived, but also your own life in society. And so you can look at any time period and see what was the human story in this character's life, and how do they relate to the human story in which we all live in contemporary terms. These are the terms I keep coming back to. It's
Right.
challenging and worthwhile. I have seen Chautauqua performed by younger performers to a very effective fashion. And I'm sure Karen can speak to this much more eloquently, having worked with younger performers. But I've seen it done very effectively.
First of all, I do want to say that to me is Chautauqua is certainly theater, but it's also storytelling.
Right.
And if you approach it as storytelling, I had a college professor who used to say, if you took the word story out of history, you're left with a meaningless syllable. And so history is story, and story is what engages us as people. I've certainly taught a number of college students and seen their growth in a character. And usually I try to gear them to about a 10-minute performance. But when I work with younger kids, I'm kind of working more for a 2 or 3 minute story that they tell within the person's life. And there was a school in my community that is in a very much a disadvantaged community. Every year I went and did a storytelling workshop and then got them doing these short stories of history. And the teachers would tell me there would be full attendance at the school. There's one boy in particular who was chronically did not attend, but when I was there, he was there every day. Another teacher told me that this was the most inclusive education he'd ever seen. And the special ed teacher told me that this was, he had never seen an artist get to his students the way storytelling did. There was one young man at this very disadvantaged school, and he told a short story of someone in history. I think he did George Washington or something. And he didn't do a great job, but he got up in front of his class and he told a story of Washington, and his mother was there. And a month later, his mother died. And he came to, when I saw him again, he said, "You know what? My mama got to see me do something right for once in my life."
It's something that can extend past the stage as well as far as participant into a broad civic engagement. I was performing as Robert Kennedy in 2018 in Greeley, Colorado, and they have a whole Chautauqua training for, they're grade school students, and they all perform a small portion of a monologue they create based on a person from history. And when I performed as Robert F. Kennedy, there was a talk back the next morning, and I was expecting to primarily see adults there. And by and large, it was an adult audience who had seen the Robert Kennedy performance the night before, but there were kids there too. And there was one particular boy, he was probably 10 or 11 years old, and he wanted to get into an in the weeds, in depth conversation about Barry Goldwater. And I was really taken off guard on that because I'm like, this is, I mean, that's 45 years ago that Goldwater was, significant figure, and this 11-year-old wants to talk about Barry Goldwater. And I just think it's a credit to the fact that it is challenging, but it really does spark interest and the ability to ask questions. And I think that's what education's for. This kid was there to talk about the performance last night, but to ask more questions too. So after I shook off my initial shock that, this 11-year-old want to talk about Barry Goldwater, I was really, encouraged about the ability of Chautauqua to reach such a broad span of audiences and really prop up that idea of civic engagement.
The nature of this style of performance is that it is one person doing it all.
Okay.
When I do a performance for myself, I do all the research. I prepare the monologue. I create a costume. I understand the history. And so I am pulling my students along through that process. I want to control the information that I have, and I want to be able to understand the history myself. No one's writing my script or preparing my costume. I know sometimes I'll hire pieces out, but I design the costume and know what I want. And
Right.
so I'm helping my students move through that entire process because that's what the process is.
It's definitely a have show will travel approach where, you are definitely um, performing many different roles in order to have a show ready to go. And so I think the training for a young Chautauquan should at least familiarize them with each of the steps in the process. Depending on the length of the training, you can go into, any amount of detail in terms of what goes into it. It's the same way with, I think, any skill set. The more ways you know about how to go about the work, the more marketable you'll be. So I think, especially with this solo style performance, being able to learn about here's how you would research a costume, or here's some ideas on how to do research and how to tell a story out of that is important.
When you are creating programs like this, any kind of integration supports each other. So you're going to get people who want to participate in both or one or the other. And by bringing them together, you get some dual participation. And also, Chautauqua characters, by their nature, raise questions and talk about issues. And so why not use some of those student performers to raise the issues in the public square performance situation? Maybe there's times they're separate, but if there could be some coalescence, I think it would be very helpful and would make your work easier because in the promotion of it. So yeah, I would say that would be a good way to begin and make that happen. Many public Chautauqua performances will include a 5-minute youth performance just to get those children performing, or young people or college age people performing in front of audiences. So the more you can integrate, I think the better you are.
I concur with what Karen's talking about. I think that, you'll reach a broader scope of audience members if these two things are intertwined with each other. Some people that would be engaged because they have one of their children involved in the youth academy, well, as a byproduct, may end up being engaged quite effectively in the public square academy. So, yeah, I would recommend that they are integrated. I would say if you're going to roll this out for the first time, I would encourage you to go with bite-sized pieces rather than fully fledged shows, so that your community can get an understanding of what this is, and you can build the appetite for it. If you have 12 5 to 8 minute monologues, that's great, which would be preferable in a first year over having a smaller number of long form shows. Just because it's the first time, the audience is getting used to it and the performers are getting used to the process as well. That would be the first thing I would recommend. And I think that also helps if you find some kind of fabric that knits the characters together through theme or through history, because you'll find that even though it is a solo performance, if you have performers that have some kind of connection to each other, it does enhance dialogue and encourages them to give feedback and enthusiasm for each other. Even as adults, when Karen and I have toured together for Ohio Chautauqua, we're always related by way of some theme or time period, and it really does push the performers toward each other in momentum, and there's a great camaraderie in that as well.
Fourth and fifth grade is the perfect place for those younger kids to be. When high school and middle school kids feel like they're getting the same thing an elementary kid is, they disengage. In order to engage these kids, you stay with that older age child for a while. I don't know if you want to say middle and high school, or say 9 through 12 or grades, or how you do that. And then one of the questions you asked was, for whom do they perform? Let them perform for those younger kids. I have many times taken high school kids and walked down the hall, or gotten into a car and driven to the middle school and the high and elementary, and it's magic because they're seeing these big kids doing what they want to do.
Having a buy-in from high school teachers in
Yes.
order to encourage that kind of research would be really helpful, because you could always bring in people to coach the writing, the narrative, the performance aspects, but coaching a student's research is something that might be more challenging, and it's the ground level stuff that having some buy-in from local teachers would really be beneficial.
I personally relate to it and love it, and I really think that our style of performance works well on Zoom.
Yeah.
I said this, for example, this year I have a library I go to every year, and I usually get 12 people to 15 people. I had 60 people at my presentation. I love Zoom.
Yeah.
Not everyone does.
Right.
And there's a lot of Zoom fatigue right now. So my advice for Zoom is to keep the audience small. I mean, for one person to talk to 100 people on Zoom, those 100 people are watching and not engaged. Whereas you're talking to 20, you can engage them.
If we were to be able to convene a core of teachers who want to buy in across several categories, the civics and drama at the various English at the various schools, what would be involved in your coming to our town, or it's a small group Zoom, in getting them to a place where they're inculcated in the ways of Chautauqua?
I worked through some distance on Zoom with a high school about 2 hours away last fall. And I found that having the prep time with the instructor, their in-class instructor, was really helpful, because I was able to get a general sense of what these students were like. And some helpful hints as far as, well, this person, they need a lot of praise for they listen to anything you say that's constructive. That was helpful in terms of me connecting with the students. And then vice versa, more to what you're talking about. I felt like being able to give some strategy, some feedback. It was much more of a give and take than something that was didactic with the instructor. So I thought it was something that was viable, but that was a one-to-one relationship with me and the instructor for the most part, except the times when I would drop in and talk with the students. Zoom is definitely a tool that can be used. Again, it just has to be, I think there has to be an understanding from what the teachers think it is, alongside with what the scholars think that they're being brought in to do too.
I think the best way to start teaching Chautauqua is to give a performance, either yourself or I bring somebody in. If they see it once, they go, "Oh, that's what I can do." And
Hmm.
they get it,
Yes.
so to start off, the very first thing you do after the words hello and glad you're here, let me introduce,
Right.
Robert Kennedy. And then you see that full performance and you understand the scope of the possibility. And then you start saying, let us tell you how to teach your students this.
I think it's a question of frequency more than duration, because you could have a day-long intensive and then the instructor, the high school teacher really runs into the question that they never would have thought of when they're actually working with the students.
Right.
So that would be
Mhm.
of importance, I think.
You all be available to them, almost on call. Um, would that be helpful?
Yeah, that could be something. That could be, just in terms of
On
having
top
conversations.
or even a weekly time to get back together by Zoom. I mean, you could do a live, one day thing
Mhm.
where we present a character and then you break it down, into the components. Here's what you're going to teach, and then they go and do it, but they come back every Friday afternoon and
Mhm.
say, this happened this week. What do I do now? I think teachers, like anybody else, need clear expectations of time. Okay, this was good. I'm going to be here until 3 o'clock today, or whatever.
One great thing about storytelling is that all actors can be all characters, so that is freeing. But as far as buy-in from the community and the audience, that could be something that might require some delicate touch.
I'm loving the idea of, as you all are describing, show them, break it
Mhm.
down,
Mhm.
and meet with them regularly. I am loving that idea.